Question number 4, Metiria Turei.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister and asks, does he stand by his statement, well, you back rapists?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, yes.
Point of order, sir.
Point of order, Metiria Turei.
Mr Speaker, as the victim of a sexual assault, I take offence to the Prime Minister's refusal to deny his statement of yesterday.
Order. It's put down as a question on notice. The Prime Minister then has to answer it. Supplementary question? You're not raising... Is this fresh point of order?
Mr Speaker.
Fresh point of order, Chris Hipkins.
Mr Speaker, it just relates to the general principle of the issue, which is where something is ruled unparliamentary and a member then reaffirms their whatever it was that they said that was unparliamentary, does that not then bring it back into the current debate?
Unfortunately, to some extent, yes. The question's been accepted. It's been ruled in order. The Prime Minister now has a responsibility to answer it. He answered it with yes. That in itself is certainly not unparliamentary. We've now got to move forward with a series, I hope, of helpful supplementaries, but if the Prime Minister then was to repeat such remarks, as I said earlier, then I will deal with that issue. Supplementary question.
Supplementary question.
Supplementary question, Metiria Turei.
Would he agree that when he made jokes about the convicted murderer and molester Philip John Smith, that he was backing the rapist and not the victims of his sexual abuse?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, no.
Supplementary.
Supplementary question, Metiria Turei.
Would the Prime Minister agree that when he said of the Roastbusters case that, quote, these young guys should just grow up, he was in fact backing those alleged rapists and not the alleged victims of those young men?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, no, but I think the member is trying to raise a defence to absolve herself from the fact that she's now learnt that 50 of the people that they have been interested in are actually rapists.
Order. Can I remind the Prime Minister of my earlier ruling, Speaker's ruling 1967. The question was answered directly. The next part of the answer is not necessary. Supplementary question.
Supplementary question.
Metiria. Order. Supplementary question, Metiria Turei.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Does the Prime Minister now consider it appropriate to apologise to Tanya Billingsley, given his government's interference in a case that involved an alleged rape against her?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr Speaker, no. What I find disappointing is that in all of this debate, the victims of these crimes in Australia and other parts have never been represented by opposition parliamentarians. Only the actual people who have perpetuated these rapes, these murders, these abhorrent acts, Mr Speaker, and unfortunately that is the reality of what's happened in this parliament in the last few weeks.
Supplementary.
Order. Supplementary question, Metiria. Order.
Does the Prime Minister think that in light of his own comments, where he has joked about rapists and child molesters, where he has backed alleged rapists of young women...
Order. Can I just have the question, please? The question.
That it is now time for the Prime Minister to show some leadership on the serious issue of sexual violence in New Zealand and apologise for his comments from yesterday?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, I do like to show leadership on that issue, but I am not responsible for other people that may advocate for people who commit crimes, not the victims of crimes.
Order. Order. Again, the member is interjecting. She may not realise it, but she is. Supplementary question, Metiria Turei.
Will the Prime Minister apologise for his comment directed at the opposition yesterday in light of his own comments where he has clearly backed rapists and alleged rapists?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
I utterly refute the last part of the question and no in terms of the first part of the question.
Point of order, sir.
Point of order, Metiria Turei.
So the Prime Minister has consistently supported his statement of yesterday. He has essentially reconfirmed that statement, and I ask he be made to apologise and withdraw because I have taken personal offence as a victim of sexual assault.
Order. I remind the member where I stand. It's time for the member to cease speaking. That's not a point of order. The Prime Minister's answer has said nothing that is unparliamentary in that answer. Question number...
Point of order, sir.
Point of order, Metiria Turei.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Having perused the...
Order, can I have the point of order?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. There is nothing in the standing orders or the Speaker's rulings which put a time limit on seeking a withdrawal and apology. The Prime Minister has affirmed his commitment to this offensive statement made, and he should...
The member will resume her seat. We spent quite some time at the start of question time today with me pointing out to the member quite clearly, if it's a matter of an unparliamentary comment made at the time and objected to at the time, I can deal with it. If it's raised subsequently, and in this case 24 hours later, the time has passed. Chris Hipkin first.
Mr Speaker, it's simply to ask you to reflect, with perhaps a considered ruling, on the matter of effective repetition. I'm not going to retraverse it here, but I would like to ask you to reflect, in light of your earlier ruling today, on whether in fact the issue of effective repetition should be reconsidered, and whether a member, maybe not using the exact words, but this was the case, I mean, in the case of the Privileges Committee, where there was an issue of a member repeating a comment outside the House. All they said was, I stand by my comment, and the courts deemed that to be an effective repetition.
Order. I will certainly, as I always do, go back and review today, but I've been listening very carefully to the answers that were given. As I have said to Metiria Turei, I don't think there's any words in the answers that were given that would concern me as being unparliamentary. The question was put down, the question was accepted, the question therefore had to be answered, and none of the supplementaries that were answered were ruled out of order either. So I will review it, but I will not promise to the member that I'll come back with a considered ruling. Is there a further point of order from Jacinda?
Well.
No, I've dealt with that matter. Point of order, Metiria Turei.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I would seek your clarification on this matter. You have ruled that the Prime Minister's statement cannot be re-litigated today because opposition members did not raise it at the first opportunity yesterday. You have seen the hand side, as have I. I raised that issue with you at the very first opportunity, and as a result of you denying that, you are now justifying not requiring the Minister to withdraw.
No. Can I just invite the member herself to take the time that I've taken to go back and watch the video clip. The comment was made. It is 4.5 minutes later that it's raised on the first occasion. My point strongly to this House, and I'm surprised that we're still having to explain it, is it must be dealt with immediately. That makes my job a lot easier. When it's then dealt with subsequently, and in fact there are a lot of other comments that are made in the meantime, it is difficult for me to then demand an apology subsequent to the event. Question number 5, the Honourable Annette King.